The first time I heard the word bundling, I was 11 years old, and I heard it the way Amish children hear most important things, by accident, standing on the wrong side of a door. Two older women in my mother's kitchen, voices low the way women's voices go when the subject is too serious for regular volume. One of them said the word, and the other made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. And then one of them said, "Well, it is what it is." And they moved on to talking about something else entirely. I stood on my side of the door for a long time after that. I did not know what bundling was. I did not ask. In our community, you did not ask about the things you heard through doors. You filed them away in the quiet part of your mind, and you waited for the world to explain itself to you in its own time. It took me 15 more years and a life I could not have imagined at 11 to finally understand what those two women were sighing about. And what I learned was not what the outside world thinks bundling is. What I learned was something older and stranger and more complicated than any explanation I have ever seen in a book or a documentary or a tourist pamphlet about Amish country. What I learned was that bundling was never really about the blanket. Before I tell you what it was really about, I have to say something honest to you first. More than 90% of the people watching this right now have never subscribed to this channel. And I understand that. You found this video because something in the title caught you, because you wanted to know something true that nobody usually says out loud. But if what you are about to hear stays with you, if it opens something in you that you did not know was closed, I hope you will subscribe and stay. It is completely free, and it helps make sure these stories, the ones that were never supposed to leave the community, keep getting told to the people who need to hear them. While you are here, tell me something in the comments. Did you grow up with a tradition you followed for years before you understood what it actually meant? Tell me. I want to know. Now let me tell you what bundling really was and what it cost the girls who went through it. My name is Clara, and this is Clara the Amish Girl, the channel where the stories that were meant to stay inside farmhouse walls finally get spoken out loud. I grew up Old Order Amish in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I was the fourth of 8 children. I was baptized into the church at 16, and I understood almost nothing about my own body or my own future at the time of that baptism. The community I grew up in had expectations for girls that began being communicated before we were old enough to understand them, through the way adults went quiet when certain subjects came near, through the way older girls looked at each other across rooms with expressions that had no name in Pennsylvania Dutch, through the things that were explained and the things that were very deliberately never explained at all. Bundling was one of the things that was never explained. It was practiced. It was expected. And the explanation, when it finally came too late to matter. For those who have never heard the word, bundling is an old courtship tradition in Amish and other plain communities. The basic description is simple. A young man courting a young woman would be permitted to spend the night in her bed, separated by a bundling board, a long wooden divider down the center of the mattress, or by layers of clothing and blankets. The purpose, as presented to the outside world and as presented to us, was practical. Courting visits happened Sunday evenings after the singings, the young people's gatherings after church. Farms were far apart. Rides were long. By the time a young man had driven his buggy to a girl's home and spent the evening visiting, it could be very late, and sending him back into the cold was considered impractical. So he stayed. In her room, in her bed. Separated, theoretically, by the board. And in the morning, he left before the household was fully awake, and everyone understood that nothing had happened, and the courtship continued. That is the version in the documentaries. that is not the version I lived. What the documentaries do not tell you is that by the time bundling happened, the girl had almost never been given a complete explanation of what it was. She had been told, if she was lucky, that a young man would be coming to call on Sunday. She had been told to be ready and to receive him well, to conduct herself with modesty and propriety. What she had not been told was that he would be staying. What she had not been told was what staying meant in practice. What she had not been told was what happened in the dark, when the board was understood by everyone to be a formality rather than a barrier. Or when the young man had expectations communicated to him very differently than they had been communicated to her. I was 16 the first time a young man came to call on me. His name was Eli, and he was 19, and he was from a good family 3 districts over, which was all I knew about him before the first Sunday he appeared in our sitting room, with his hat in his hands and his hair pressed flat from where the hat had been. My mother served us pie, and then she left the room. And something in the way she left, in the careful deliberateness of her footsteps going away from us, told me that I was now in a situation that had rules I did not know yet. Eli was not cruel. I want to say that clearly because this story is not about cruelty in the obvious sense. Eli was a young man who had been told, in the specific way that young Amish men are told things, what bundling meant and what his role in it was. He had been told by older men, by his father or his brothers or the older boys in his district, in the language that men use among themselves when women are not present. He had been given a version of bundling that was categorically different from the version I had been given. His version included information mine did not. His version included expectations mine did not name. And when Sunday night turned late, and my mother appeared at the stairs to say goodnight with a particular kind of finality that was not an accident, and when Eli looked at me with a question in his eyes that I did not quite know how to read, I understood that something was being asked of me that I had not been prepared to answer. I said goodnight to him in the sitting room, and I went upstairs, and I lay in my bed in the dark, and I waited to understand what was going to happen next. And the door opened, and Eli came in. And I lay very still, and I thought, this is bundling. This is what the women in my mother's kitchen were sighing about. And I had no language for what I felt in that moment, because I had been given no language for it. Only the instruction to conduct myself with modesty and propriety. Only the instruction to be a good girl. I want to stop here because I know what some of you are thinking. There are people who will say that bundling was innocent, that the board was real, that nothing improper happened in a proper Amish home. And I believe that in some homes and districts, that was true. There were families where bundling was exactly what the brochures said, a supervised courting custom with clear limits. Those families existed. I was not one of them. And in the years since I left, I have spoken with enough women from enough communities to know that I was not alone. The thing that made bundling complicated was not the tradition itself. It was the information gap. The gap between what boys were told and what girls were told. The gap between what parents knew and what daughters were allowed to know. The gap between the formal explanation and the informal reality in the dark on a Sunday night when no one was going to come and check. My mother never asked me what happened those Sunday nights. Not directly. She asked, in the way Amish mothers ask things they already know the answer to, whether Eli and I were getting on well, whether I found him agreeable, whether I thought he would make a steady husband. Not, do you feel safe? Not, has anything happened that you did not want? Those questions did not exist in the vocabulary available to her, and I do not think she was cruel for not asking them. I think she had also been a 16-year-old girl lying in a dark room, trying to understand what was being asked of her body. and she had learned to call that learning growing up. To not look at it too directly, because looking too directly would have required saying something out loud that she had spent her whole life learning not to say. Eli and I courted for 8 months. At the end of those 8 months, the expectation was clear. Marriage was the next step, and the shape of those Sunday nights had built a kind of gravity that made it feel almost inevitable. I was 17. I had spent 8 months in a courtship I had not fully chosen or fully understood from the beginning. And the conclusion was that I was now expected to marry a man I had spoken to about weather and farming and scripture and almost nothing else. I did not marry Eli. That is not the story. I want to tell you what happened instead because it contains the thing I most needed you to understand. My oldest sister was the one who finally told me the truth. Not about bundling specifically, about all of it. About the way the system worked and what it was designed to do. She came to my room one evening 3 weeks before Eli's family was going to come to speak formally with my father. And she sat on the edge of my bed in the near dark. And she told me things in the quiet, careful way of a woman who has been holding information a long time and finally decided someone else needs to have it. She told me that bundling was never really about convenience. That story, the story about the long buggy ride and the cold weather and the impracticality of sending him home late, that story was the surface of the thing. Underneath it, bundling was about commitment, about creating, through those Sunday nights, a situation from which retreat became socially and practically very difficult. Once a young man had spent multiple nights in a girl's home, once the community knew the shape of the courtship, once the girl's parents had sanctioned the visits and the nights, there was an understanding, an unspoken but absolute understanding, that the matter was essentially settled. The girl was spoken for. Not in any formal or legal sense, but in the sense that matters most inside a small, closed community where everyone knows everything, and reputation is currency. And a girl who had been bundled with a young man for 8 months and then did not marry him became a particular kind of subject. The kind that other young men's mothers discussed carefully before allowing their sons to call. I sat on my bed and I listened. And I felt the architecture of the past 8 months arrange itself in my mind in a new shape. I felt the gravity I had identified, the seeming inevitability of marriage, reveal its actual source. The inevitability was not natural. It had been constructed, brick by brick, Sunday by Sunday, by a tradition designed to move girls from one status to another with as little explicit consent as possible, because explicit consent would have required telling girls things they were very carefully not being told. I looked at my sister in the near dark of my room, and I stayed very still for a long moment. Then I said, "Did you know this when you were going through it yourself?" And she said, "I knew it by the end." And I said, "Why did you not tell me before?" And she said the thing that has stayed with me longer than anything else she said that evening. She said, "Because telling you would have meant saying it out loud. And saying it out loud would have meant it was true. And if it was true, I did not know what to do with it. So I did not say it until you needed to hear it more than I needed to not say it." I did not marry Eli. My father was not pleased. The visit from Eli's family was awkward and final. I became, for a period of about 2 years, exactly the kind of subject I described earlier. Not ruined in any dramatic sense, just subtly devalued in the accounting our community kept, quietly and constantly, of its young women. Other invitations came more slowly. I was looked at by certain older women with an expression that said, "Here is a girl who understands her own worth, incorrectly. I was 22 before another young man came to call, and by then I had spent 4 years thinking about what my sister had said in the near dark and thinking about all the things that had been carefully not explained to me and why the not explaining had been so deliberate. I left when I was 24. I will not tell the full story of my leaving today because it belongs to a different video. But I will tell you that when I sat years later in a small office in Philadelphia with a therapist who had a lighthouse poster on her wall, and I tried to explain what bundling had been, I could not find the words for a long time. She had them. She gave them to me one at a time, carefully, the way you give a person who has not eaten something gentle before anything harder. Coercive structure. Manufactured consent. The systematic withholding of the information necessary to choose. In my community, we had one word for all of that. We called it tradition. We called it the old way. We called it how things had always been done, because continuity was the highest value, and questioning continuity was the thing you simply did not do. I want to be careful here because this story is not about condemning the people inside the tradition. My mother was not a villain. My father was not a monster. The families who practiced bundling generation after generation were doing what had been done to them, what had been handed down through so many generations that it had stopped being a choice and had become simply the shape of the world. The girls who emerged and married kind men and built lives they found meaningful, those girls existed too. The tradition was not uniformly destructive to every person it touched. What it was, uniformly, was a system in which girls were moved through a process of enormous consequence without the information or the language to participate as full agents of their own lives. Not the blanket, not the board, not the buggy ride. The thing was always the information gap, the deliberate intergenerational silence around what was actually happening and why. If you grew up inside a tradition that moved you somewhere before you understood where you were going, I see you. If you were ever handed an expectation dressed up as a custom and told to receive it with gratitude and modesty, I see you. If there was ever a door in your childhood home that you stood on the wrong side of, listening to women say things in low voices that you were not old enough to decode, but old enough to know mattered, I see you. You were not naive. You were not foolish. You were a girl in a system that had spent generations perfecting the art of keeping girls exactly uninformed enough to keep them exactly where the system needed them. And that is not your failure. That is the system's design. The 11-year-old me at that kitchen door was not ignorant. She was being kept. There is a difference. And knowing that difference is the thing that finally made it possible to speak. Before you go, I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for staying with this story all the way to the end. I know there are more videos in this world than any of us could ever watch, and you chose to spend this time here, and I do not take that lightly, not for a single moment. But I want to tell you something I keep noticing, something that stays with me. More than 90% of the people who watch these videos have never subscribed. And I think about that the way I used to think about the older women in my community who listened to everything and understood everything, and then went very quiet and moved on to talking about something else. If this story touched something in you, if it named something you have been carrying for a long time without a name for it, I hope you will subscribe. It is free. It helps these stories keep reaching the women and the men and the children who need to hear them most. And before you leave, tell me in the comments, what is the one tradition from your own upbringing that you followed for years before you finally understood what it was really about? I want to read every single answer. Until next time, remember this. A tradition that requires your silence to survive was never really a tradition. It was a system, and you were always allowed to name it.